Welcome to Policy on Demand. I'm Sindhu Blume.
And I'm Scott McCandless. It is the week of September 11th, and this is your Monday briefing. It may be hard to believe that more than 2 decades have passed, but this is the 22nd anniversary of the September 11th, 2001 attacks, and we share our remembrances and well wishes with all of you.
Thanks, Scott. And before we dive into today's episode, a note that an episode will follow on the notice covering the Section 174 capitalization and amortization of certain R&E costs. And later in this episode, we'll have Will Morris commenting on the G20 comments on the Two-Pillar Project. With that, I'd like to welcome Craig Stronberg to talk about this weekend's G20 meeting in New Delhi. Craig, welcome.
Thank you.
Let me start off with a very simple question, and that is, why should businesses focus on the G20 meeting? What is the impact?
I think it's always been a good idea since the G20 was founded for business leaders to be aware of this. But if you think about the last 2 or 3 years as we've been having these conversations, business leaders across sectors, across countries are worried about the level of geopolitical risk now more than they have ever been before. So anytime that you have the leadership of the top 20 economies in the world coming together, even though they profess in statements to say this is not about geopolitics, it's only about the economy, it's also about geopolitics, right? Anytime you're doing diplomacy, you're also doing geopolitics. And so regardless of what comes out in the communique or the press, what business leaders should be looking for are the signals that are sent about the degree of geopolitical unity or disunity. And one of the challenges for MNCs across the world, but especially in the US in the last couple of years, has been a lot of disunity. I think the Indians did as good a job as they possibly could have as host, but disunity won. And I think, evidence number one of that is the statement on Ukraine, where they really couldn't come up with the language to even call Ukraine the same thing. And that might seem like a small failure, but I think it is a sign that disunity continues to be a part of the G20. And that means when business leaders are trying to figure out, can these national leaders go behind closed doors and work this out for our benefit? The answer isn't going to be an automatic yes.
So what about the G20's objectives? What were their ideals going in, some of the areas in which they were seeking common ground, and how did they stand coming out?
So they were looking to make a lot of progress on a lot of big topics like climate change, but one of the things that I think is always probably useful is that when these events occur, right, there's the press and there's the single source that all the press is using, which is the statement, which is in this case 40 pages long and not particularly exciting, which is I read it, so you don't have to. But part of the reason you want to read it is you want to see what order they put the priorities in the final communique. And the top priority is sustainable global growth. Right, this is the thing that every one of these 20 is most worried about. They are worried about the slow pace of global growth. Now, this is a little contrary to what a lot of us are hearing in the US because things are potentially, likely, hopefully looking better in the US now than we thought it might have 6 months ago. But for many of these economies, that's not the case. And there is increasing risk to the downside globally. There is slowing growth globally. There's very unsure growth globally. Part of what the G20 started as a conversation here that we're going to hear a lot more about in the coming years is they are trying to contemplate, are those who help manage global world debt like the World Bank doing this in a way that benefits everybody? So there's a lot of the communique that is dedicated to the global financial sector, to how debt is structured and funded, and should that be rethought so developing countries and some of those on the lower end of the G20 tier might have more advantage.
Let's get a little granular now in terms of next steps for companies. What are they from this meeting? What are their takeaways?
For the better part of 20 years, we wonks, which is us three, right? We've been talking about, theorizing about the possibility that the Global South would sort of have its turn in the sunshine. I don't know that we're quite there yet, but we're getting closer. If you think about, which is a very artificial construct, geopolitical power as 100 units that could be distributed across countries in the world. I think what we've seen in the last 4 or 5 years is those units are moving. right? Some countries are losing a little power, some countries are gaining. The Global South is gaining two things. It is gaining power and it is gaining agreement amongst itself that it does not like the way that the global rules and the economy were written by primarily the US or Europe. Whether or not that's a fair observation, that's sort of their point of view. And they are now sort of slowly coalescing, and you saw a lot of this at the G20. And it's interesting that the previous presidency of the G20 was Indonesia. Now it's India. Next it goes to Brazil, and after that it goes to South Africa. Right, so you've got sort of 4 in the row of big players in the Global South that we don't know, but I suspect are going to coordinate on messages. And so I think the big thing coming out of this that we're going to see in future G20s that MNCs need to pay attention to, because this could restructure global markets in the long run, is that the Global South is ambitious for more power and more say. And that could change global trade and global trade agreements and all the rest of that. I think the other thing is that the African Union got added, which is long overdue, right? And they got the appropriate press attention for that. And that's a good thing too. The last thing I'll say here is that there are at least 3 countries in the G20, the US being one of them, the others being Mexico and India, that are going to have national elections next year. So the G20 could look very different, at the next summit than it does today. And that could also change sort of the answer to your first question about why companies should care.
All right, so you've got the Global South. What should companies be doing when they think about their businesses going forward and the rise of the Global South? How do they relate?
So the biggest thing here is huge potential opportunity, right? A lot of what multinational companies have thought about in the past in terms of foreign markets have been the G20, right? Some of which are still even considered developing markets. But there's real opportunity in the Global South, right? In countries like Indonesia, Vietnam, India, that are now part of the conversation as we think about supply chain shifts or diversification. These are not markets where all, especially US companies, have equal knowledge or understanding, right? Many companies have been doing business in China for years. The China acumen is very high. They've been doing business in Mexico for years. Their Mexico acumen is very high. Their acumen about the Global South is lower on the average. So this means that now, as the Global South is trying to come together to figure out how does it want to shape trade, technology, investment policy, now is the time that US companies should be understanding this. So they're not the last one in the door 15, 20 years from now. They can understand and make the right investments now as they start to grow.
Craig, you mentioned the Global South. We've been talking a little bit about the G20. We could think of this in terms of the BRICS countries and the G7. Could you talk a little bit about how those overlap? There's some concentric circles there, but also how perhaps some of their priorities differ, G7, BRICS, and G20.
Yeah, I mean, they do overlap, right? Every member of the G7 is a part of the G20. I mean, the G7 is an informal institution. It really doesn't have a secretariat or a body that runs it. Sort of, they trade off someone to sort of be the coordinator, and it's heavily influenced by the finance/treasury ministers of the world. Those countries tend to have very similar geopolitical and macroeconomic outlooks and philosophies on life, right? They're sort of old allies. The G20 is a more diverse group. BRICS is an attempt by, in part, the Global South, although China really isn't a Global South, to say that there is an alternative to the point of view and the rules that the G7 has set up. Now, they haven't always made a lot of progress. I think they've made a lot of progress of late. And you saw this in some of the new countries that they added. And you saw this, that countries that don't always get along, like India and China, they prioritize making time for one another. And at the recent summit, you saw, Modi and Xi sitting down with one another. That's not a small thing. So I don't know that the BRICS is going to be a real alternative to the G7, and I don't think that the BRICS is going to be a threat to the dollar or anything of that regard. But it is something that global businesses should pay attention to, because like the rise of the Global South, this could change the global operating environment dramatically in the coming years.
Interesting. Craig, as always, fantastic advice. Thank you very much for being here, and appreciate your insights as always.
Thank you for having me back.
Appreciate it. And separately, as Sindhu noted at the top, we had a chance to check in with Will Morris about the two-pillar project declaration that emerged from the latest G20. We wanted to share those comments with you now.
So the G20 heads of government met in New Delhi, India over the weekend, and they issued a declaration and it, as expected, included the normal paragraph on tax. Now, there are a couple of things to note about this. The first is there is still great pressure on the timelines. They say, perhaps aspirationally, that they hope that the final issues with the multilateral convention, that's Amount A of Pillar 1, on reallocating tax to other countries, that'll be sorted out by the end of 2023, and that the convention will be ready for signature. They also say